I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey through that. So I'm going to go into screen sharing now. So does anybody know the name of this artist? This is an artist that you can just type it in the chat if you know the name of this artist. This is an artist that I discovered while I was at Waring, and Jose had a little art library that was actually up at the house. Oh, Olga, you got it, Michelangelo. Jose had a little art library. It was separate from the rest of the library. It was all of Jose's personal art books, and they were up in a little corner alcove up in the house. And that's fine, you misspelled it, that's okay. It's a difficult one to spell. And so I used to look at these art books, and this was my first introduction to drawing, the drawings of Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel. And so I was an artist at Waring, and I really wanted to go to art school, and I just loved all these art books. And I felt like when I went to art school, I was going to learn how to draw like Michelangelo. So this is Michelangelo's drawing that he did as a study for a painting on the Sistine Chapel. And so I got to art school, and we studied a lot of things about art. I actually learned about these two artists while I was at Waring. Does anybody know the name of these two artists? You can just type either one of them or both of them if you know them. These are two different artists. Good, we've got a Van Gogh, and Monet, exactly. So these are pretty well-known artists. Almost everybody knows Van Gogh and Monet. As you know, there's a really amazing exhibition going on about Van Gogh in New York right now. And I want you to take a look at the dates of these. This is from 1889 and 1897. So this is late 1800s, late 19th century. And this is really the beginning of a new era in art that looks like, since you guys all know Van Gogh and Monet, that you've probably heard a little bit about this before. Now I'm going to show you two more paintings that are a little more difficult. And I'm really curious if anybody knows these painters. I'd be surprised if anybody knows these painters, but if you do, go ahead and type them. And one of them is particularly hard to spell. And so if you don't know how to spell it, that's okay. Does anybody know the name of these two painters? These two painters were the most famous painters in the same time period as these artists. And they were extremely successful in their lifetimes. They both taught. Nobody knows the names of these artists. I'm not surprised. I went to 4 years of art school and did not know the names of these artists. The artist on the left is a British painter named Solomon J. Solomon. And the artist on the right is a French painter named Bouguereau. I know that left picture is dope. I'm going to talk about it. You can see that both these dates are still really late 1800s, late 19th century. So 1887, 1879. These painters were so famous. Bouguereau was a recipient of the Legion of Honor medal in France, which was only given to the topmost cultural recognition by the government. He painted Napoleon III, and he was an extremely influential art teacher. He was extremely well known. He was probably the most famous artist in the 1880s in France. Solomon J. Solomon, he was so famous that he was invited to paint George V and Queen Mary. He was the president of the Royal Society of British Artists. So it's kind of amazing. You can actually study art history. You can study late 19th century art history in many art schools and never hear these names. If you do hear these names, they'll be as a footnote, but that you won't really understand that these were actually two of the most famous among several hundred extremely famous artists working at the time, and financially successful artists and very influential teachers working at this time. So why don't we know who these artists are? Look at this painting. This is amazing. So this painting these figures are almost life size. So this painting is huge. This is a painting of Samson and Delilah. And so we're telling the story of Delilah's betrayal of Samson. And you can see this huge swooping composition of Delilah is betraying Samson, and he's looking back at her, and he can't believe what she's done to him, and he's being restrained and taken down. He's going to be tortured. And this artist is showing us, not only can he draw the figure and paint the figure, but he can draw and paint the figure of wrestling together in relationship to each other. And then look what he does here. He throws in a carpet, and he throws in a tiger skin rug. Why is he putting in those details there? He's putting in those details basically just to show that he can paint lots of stuff. He can paint this amazing carpet drapery. He can even paint fur. He can paint all of these different textures. He's really actually showing off. He's in his mid-20s. He's about 26 when he paints this. He's at the dawn of the heights of his career, and he wants to show everybody that I am among the best painters in all of art history. I am right up there with the greats. So what was his idea of art history? Who were his old master painters? And so what Solomon J. Solomon would have seen as an old master painter is Van Dyck would be an example among many others. So Van Dyck, you can see he's painted the exact same scene as Van Dyck. This is the same story of Samson and Delilah. It's a really big active scene. It's also very large. The figures are life size. We've got drapery going on. We have people wrestling. And you can see that Solomon J. Solomon is actually saying, you know what? I'm not only as good as Van Dyck, I might actually be better than Van Dyck. He is really competing with Van Dyck. Van Dyck made this painting 257 years earlier than Solomon J. Solomon. And sometimes when we think of the old master painters, we think of them all kind of at the same time, all in the past, but they were hundreds of years apart. And so each painter is looking back at the previous painters. And so what do you think that Van Dyck is looking at? We can see what Van Dyck is looking at. Anybody recognize who this artist is again? We just saw this artist before. This is Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel, his painting on the Sistine Chapel. This is Adam. So Adam by Michelangelo was painted 118 years before the Van Dyck. So Van Dyck is looking at Michelangelo and he's trying to keep up with Michelangelo. He's like, Michelangelo is my art hero. I want to show that I can paint even better than Michelangelo. I'm going to take everything that Michelangelo learned and I'm going to do even better. And so Michelangelo's painting is a fresco, so the colors aren't as rich and dark, but Michelangelo is an amazing painter. And as you know, he was mainly a sculptor and he got a huge amount of inspiration from sculpture. So Michelangelo, who's Michelangelo looking at? Who's his art heroes, his art inspiration? Because before Michelangelo's at the dawn of the Renaissance, he's in the early 1500s. There aren't a lot of painters before Michelangelo that painted as well as Michelangelo. He really was the best, along with Leonardo da Vinci and a very few others in his time period. So who is he learning from? Who is he getting his inspiration from? Is he just doing this because he can just do it from imagination? He's just born being able to do it? No, he's actually studying very, very hard. And what he is studying is he's studying Greek and Roman sculpture that is being dug up during his lifetime and excavated in Rome. Michelangelo was known to go and visit this sculpture. It's called the Belvedere Torso. It is in Rome. This is actually my photograph of it. Noel, my husband Noel and I had an amazing experience. We were in the room alone with the Belvedere Torso, which never happens. I'll tell you the secret to making that happen if you want to go to the Vatican and learn how to be alone with the sculptures. And so I was able to take this picture with no other people in the picture. It's usually surrounded by crowds of people. This is the Belvedere Torso. It was excavated in Rome in the 1430s when Michelangelo, before he was born, right before he was born. So during his lifetime, this is a very famous sculpture, and it was always, ever since then, it's been exhibited in the Vatican in Rome. Michelangelo would go and he would study the sculpture and he would draw it and he would study from it hours every single day. There's witnesses of the time who said that how much he studied it. He was actually asked by the Pope to restore this, to actually build out all the missing arms and legs from this sculpture. And he turned the Pope down. He said, I'm not worthy. I'm not able to do this. You can see that he did in this drawing that he did as a preparatory drawing for his painting of Michelangelo, for his painting of Adam. He's really studying this twisting torso movement, and you'll see this twisting torso of the Belvedere Torso in many of Michelangelo's most famous paintings. This Belvedere Torso was used throughout history. So many people drew the Belvedere Torso, not only Belvedere Torso, but lots of different ancient Greek and Roman sculpture from the 1st century and even earlier to learn how to draw and paint the human figure, because during the Middle Ages, there wasn't an interest in drawing and painting realistically. There was a different kind of painting. So the dawn of the Renaissance is this new kind of painting where we're really trying to figure out how people look, how they move, how do we draw and paint things from life that look three-dimensional? How does the light fall on the surface and allow us to see the structure of the form? And these drawings right here span hundreds of years of artists all studying from the same sources. This drawing here on the right is all the way up to the late 19th century. This was done in about 1866. This is a late 19th century drawing by the painter Gérôme. Gérôme was another painter that you might not have known his name, but he was one of the most famous, most successful, and most renowned teachers in the late 19th century. So we've gone all the way from 1500 up through 1900, so 400 years of people studying ancient Greek and Roman sculpture and studying previous painters to figure out how do we draw and paint realistically, all the way up to the 19th century. And this drawing was actually created as a lithograph, and it was created in a whole series of lithographic plates, is what they're called. They're big drawings, and they're reproduced in plates, and they were handed out all over Europe to all the art schools of Europe, so that art students in late 19th century could all be drawing from the same drawing. So they would actually copy the drawings before they went and copied plaster casts of the statues. So this book of drawings was really the standard of art education by the late 19th century. The artist who did this is, you can see the name down here, is Bargue, Charles Bargue. He's the lithographer who made the prints from Jean-Léon Gérôme. This artist is a very famous artist. You will know his name when you see his later work. This is one of the most famous artists of the early 20th century, and he really, studied in this really classical way. This is called classical art because we're studying from classical Greek and Roman sculpture. And he is actually drawing these Bargue plates by Gérôme. He's not drawing from the original sculptures. He's actually copying the drawings that were made for all art students. And I'm not even going to ask, because I don't even think, unless somebody wants to quickly type it in, I don't even think most people would guess who this artist is, but you'll know in the next slide. This artist is actually Picasso, and Picasso did these drawings when he was only 12 or 13 years old. So he was Tim Bachlin's age when he was drawing these drawings and studying to be an artist. And of course, he became very well known for breaking all the rules of art and heading us off in a direction of art that went towards abstraction. And there's a lot of different reasons that the world of art went towards abstraction, but you can see the Picasso painting is heading us off in this direction through the 50s, through the 70s, all the way up through 1981. This guy Basquiat on the right in 1981 was the hero of my art school. I never heard of Solomon J. Solomon. I never heard of Bouguereau, but I heard a lot about Basquiat when I was in art school. And he's sort of, I would say Banksy is sort of the level of fame that he had in the 80s. And so all of the art students were trying to be like Basquiat. And so we weren't necessarily taught to draw and paint realistically from life. So I went through all of art school saying, at what point do I get to learn to draw like Michelangelo? Like I came to art school to learn to draw like Michelangelo. So do we do that our sophomore year? Do we do that our junior year? Do we do that our senior year? And I graduated from art school and I was like, I guess we're just never going to learn how to do that. And I decided that people alive today were not capable of doing that. It was some sort of talent that people were born with in the past that people alive today just couldn't do. That was my only understanding of why my teachers couldn't paint like this. Nobody was teaching like this, and none of my fellow students were doing anything like this. It was all seemed part of ancient history. And so it was very surprising to me. I became a graphic designer, and I was a graphic designer for about 12 years. And I always really wanted to be a painter. And so in my early 30s, I was able to return to painting after being a graphic designer for many years. And in that time, the internet made things much more accessible to us. And so all of these ways that people were being taught and trained how to draw and paint in the 19th century that isn't actually taught in art schools. Suddenly you could find teachers who were teaching this online, and you could tap into, you could go and visit and take workshops. And so I spent a few years just taking workshops and studying with people who taught this method of painting and drawing. And I got so excited about it, and it was such a huge transformation in my own painting and drawing that I immediately turned around and started teaching it. And so I ran an art school here in San Francisco for about 10 years, teaching drawing and painting in this classical method. And this is Bargue, that'll B-A-R-G-U-E. I have it spelled out because he's a guy, he's got a really weird name. It's a name I've never heard before. He's French, but that doesn't even sound like a French word. So Bargue, B-U-E. B-A-R-G-U-E, and he was the lithographer who made the prints of the famous teacher Jerome's drawings. And so this is actually one of my students drawing a copy of one of the Bargue plates. And so I teach in this method where we're all going back to the source, and we are drawing from the same sources that everybody from Michelangelo through Jerome and through Solomon J. Solomon learned to draw and paint realistically, because I've always been interested in drawing and painting realistically, and not everybody wants to do abstraction. This is a drawing that my student, my former student, who's now an instructor in my school, he did this drawing of the famous Bargue plate of the Belvedere Torso that we've been looking at. He did this in pencil, and he's doing a demonstration for our students, the students that we both teach. And so you can see he has a breakdown of the values. He has a value sphere showing the direction of the light and how the light behaves in the sphere. He has a practice strip, we call these value scales, where you learn to use your pencil to a very, very fine degree of refined shading. And then he has his completed drawing here. So this drawing was completely filmed from beginning to end. And so this is a course on my website that students can take to learn how to do this. This is another one of my students. They're drawing the same drawing that you saw Picasso drew when Picasso was 12 or 13 years old. And then once students finish working on their plates, they can start doing cast drawing. And we have a series of casts. You can actually see one, if you can see me right now, behind my head. This is the same hand cast drawing that my student did. And so we set up casts with a very simple light source, and students learn to draw and paint these casts and learn the traditional way of learning to draw and paint anatomy and light on form. And this is the whole process that they go through when they study with me. This is my drawing that I did for my students to demonstrate cast drawing to them. This is a 19th century statue sculpture, and it's an anatomical study of a horse. It's a flayed horse. They didn't actually flay a horse. It's just based on the anatomy they study of horses. And so I did this drawing over the course of took me about 2 years. While I was teaching my students, I would have this drawing in the corner of the room, and I would work on it whenever my students were working. These are some figure drawings that I have done alongside my students. We would hire models and work for models in long poses, anywhere from 6 hours to 40 hours for a pose. And it was through studying cast drawing and Bargue plates and studying the master paintings of my art heroes that I learned how to draw this way, because I did not learn how to draw the figure to this degree of ability when I went to four-year art school. So I went to four-year art school and we did figure drawing, but we really only did 20-minute poses. We never did long poses. We didn't do a real thorough study of anatomy, and we didn't really study much art history because the goal of art school today is really to prepare people to be more modern artists. But there's a lot of people who go to art school who actually want to learn to paint and draw realistically, and they either sort of decide that they're just going to be abstract artists, or they get really discouraged and they stop painting, which is what happened to me. And that's why I came back to painting in my early 30s and was like, there's got to be a way to learn what I've always wanted to learn. So that's why I'm really excited to share this whole lineage of drawing and painting with anybody who's interested. And in my art school, we start by sharpening our pencils. We sharpen our pencils so they are deadly weapons. And if you drop one of these on the floor, you lose about 25 cents worth of pencil. So you work pretty hard to be pretty careful with these once you sharpen them up. And every single one of my students starts with the very first barg plate. And this is just a simple drawing of eyes with just a few lines, and you start to learn all the steps for making these elaborate studies. I have a couple of my paintings to show. Would you like me to show a couple of my paintings? Okay, I'm getting some thumbs up from the audience. So I'm gonna go a couple paintings. This is a painting that I did. I mostly do still life painting, actually. And I'm really interested in the golden age of still life painting, which is Dutch painting in the 1650s. And I set these up in my studio, and I work from life, and this painting probably took me about 100 hours over the course of about a month. And this is another one that I do. This is crumpled wax paper, and I use this crumpled wax paper to make these really dramatic scenes that looks like a storm or something like that. And I really like doing that with really calm, stable objects like the silver reflective vases. This is a painting I did copying a Bouguereau painting. So Bouguereau had a little sketch that he did of a young lady, and I wanted to learn about Bouguereau's painting method. So whenever I see a painting that I'm curious about how the artist did it, I actually do a copy of the painting. And that's something that I teach my students as well. And this is another little still life that I did, just a simple study of a seashell here in my studio. So this one I would have done over the course of maybe 2 days. So this is maybe a 6-hour painting. So you can do anything from a 6-hour painting to a 100-hour painting. And just kind of taking your time and really spending time with the subject. And we work 100% from life, which is a value that José taught me all those years ago that has always stayed in my mind and always been a value of mine as well as an artist. So I think that's all I have to say. If anybody has any questions, I'm very, very happy to answer any questions. And if we have anybody who is particularly interested in art, do I ever paint from a photo? Yes, I do sometimes paint from photos. I don't have anything against painting from photos. And in some situations, you need to paint from photos. For example, it's very hard to paint children from life. There's lots of things that are very, very hard to paint from life. So I'm not against painting from photos. It's more that you should learn to paint and draw from working from life, working from something really sitting in front of you. And once you learn to paint and draw to a certain level of ability, you can apply that knowledge to working from photos. If you only ever copy photos, then your work only ever looks like photos. So.
With that seashell painting, there's like some very scratchy texture. Was that just the canvas, or is that detail that you put in?
That's mostly the canvas, and there's different ways that you can, with a really light touch, just drag your brush over the surface to emphasize that texture. So some of my paintings have a lot more texture, and they're on a more textured canvas, and then some of my paintings are on a very smooth panel, and there's almost no texture at all. It's kind of the effect that you want to get and how much time you want to spend on a painting.
Sadie, thank you so much. Are there any other questions for Sadie before we pivot to announcements? Okay, on that mellifluous note, let's have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much again, Sadie. It was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Sadie.
Sadie.
Thanks, everyone. Happy afternoon.